Welcome to Playtell, where we attempt to analyse how storytelling merges with interactivity in video games, and do so by deconstructing different game stories according to a 12-stage system that we call the gamer's journey. This is a story structure model loosely based on Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey and Blake Snyder's Save the Cat beat sheet. Both of these models primarily apply to film, but can also be used to study structure in books, television, and hopefully games too. There are elements of story structure that all traditional tales should theoretically include in order to convey an effective dramatic narrative, and these models pretty much cover all of them. But in games, we need to adapt how we define the different stages of those models in order to apply them to an interactive narrative. This is primarily due to the player having an active role in the story itself. There are always exceptions to the rule, and here these are typically arcade games or multiplayer games with more free-form story worlds, along with some non-linear narratives. Undertale, for example, has 3 very different plot arcs depending on how you play the game, yet all 3 of these could also be considered part of one whole single story arc. Anyway, enough justification, let's move on to explanations and take a look at the 12 different stages of the gamer's journey. Spoilers ahead. World building is where we not only introduce the setting, but also contextualise the way the player is going to interact with their environment. For example, Hyrule in Breath of the Wild is a sprawling playground full of mysterious characters with a big baddie looming over all. The cities of GTA encapsulate overwhelming satires of capitalist America, full of easily hateable egos. And the Mushroom Kingdom is a fantasy world full of squishy creatures, special powers hidden in bricks, and bountiful platforming potential. In all of these instances, they show the way the player is going to play as being a natural and justifiable part of that world. Even if it's as simple as stating there's a brewing military conflict in the Middle East, as in Call of Duty, you can presume your job as a soldier is going to involve following orders and firing guns. The first moments where the player puppeteers the playable character of a game are pivotal to forging a bond between the audience and the role they will play in the narrative. We need to know who we are and gain a sense of what we are capable of doing in order to progress and better embody the character that we are performing. This can be disorientating, like waking up as Shell in Portal with a vague awareness that you might be a test subject, or create empathy with the character's equilibrium, as in Firewatch, where we dictate the mistakes that led to the tragedy of the protagonist's backstory. This stage might not involve other characters, it could simply be text on a screen, but here we learn the very basics of how to play, as well as inducting our character into the story world. In many examples, this is often delivered by a major character because it creates an immediate emotional bond between the player and the character that taught them how to be. Sometimes this is used to instill emotional weight, as in Undertale, where your relationship with your mentor defines the protagonist's moral compass. In other cases, it can simply instruct the player how to progress, but it's often more entertaining when it does this in an original way, such as Far Cry Blood Dragon, where the player character bemoans the belittling tutorial process. Here, something dramatic happens that drags the player out of their comfort zone and gives them a ticket to the adventure of their lifetime. It's the opportunity presented to the player that allows for the whole narrative to fall into place. In films, this is typically followed by a stage where the protagonist debates whether or not they are prepared to undertake this mission, but in games we've already accepted the call by buying the game itself, so there's no need for doubt. All that does is delay the player from the experience they were advertised. Examples of the call to duty could be owing a huge amount of money to the mob, as in GTA 5, or simply becoming trapped inside the story world established in the first step, especially if that world happens to be somewhat spooky and underwater, such as Rapture or the setting of Soma. This is where the player character takes their first steps on their adventure, crossing the threshold from their equilibrium into the unknown world. When Nathan Drake accepts his brother's request to steal pirate treasure, for example, or when the player first chooses to obey or disobey the narrator in the Stanley Parable. The player learns more about the world and the context for their actions by meeting new characters, completing errands, or simply exploring. This is the player becoming familiar with how they can interact with the world, the gameplay in relation to the story, and the role they have within the narrative. In RPGs and open world games like Skyrim and The Witcher, this stage might include all the side quests that flesh out the story world, which means it technically could persist in the background of the main story throughout, available for the player to access when they wish to gain experience and learn more about their playground. A Aside from the optional missions and general foregrounding of the narrative in the previous stage, there are also some main story levels that allow the player to learn how they can control their character, as well as discover and unlock the abilities they can use over the course of the game. This stage also helps to enforce a deeper understanding of the mechanics of the gameplay, often alongside expressing the game's theme itself. By the end of this stage, the game should be ready to throw everything it has at the protagonist, knowing the player has the necessary skills to deal with it. The big plot shift. Aristotle states that a complex plot is one that has an emotional reversal, where good fortune turns to bad, or the hero finally discovers a glimmer of light after a bleak, dark tunnel. I think this is true of game narratives too, and can both be used to change the player's approach to gameplay or the story itself. This is always best when it directly affects how the player interacts with the game, or when the player believes they have actively done something to cause this dramatic change. This stage can also be known as death and rebirth, and in games the reawakening for the protagonist should be in conjunction with a change in the player's understanding of both the story and their role within it. Spoilers from here on in, but two great examples of this are the white phosphorus moment in Spec Ops: The Line, or the beheading in Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. And now the player gets it. Whatever deeper meaning the game has been hiding is finally unveiled, and the protagonist understands what they have to do to complete their ultimate goal. The player character has a means to an end to fulfill their destiny. This can either be the learning of how to resolve the fallout of the previous stage, or the first steps in the right direction. For example, when Shell breaks out of the testing chambers and makes her way to GLaDOS, or in Modern Warfare when Soap makes steps towards tracking down and killing Imran Zakhaev to make his mentor proud. Everything is in place. The player has a door ahead of them leading to the third and final act, but they might not be ready to step through just yet. In very linear games, this will be the journey from the midpoint to the finale. In more open games, this is when the player is aware of the final mission coming up and has the option to divert from the story as they prepare, essentially returning to stage 6 until they are ready for a big finish. Deciding to take upon the quest that leads you to the filtration system of Fallout 3 in its original form, especially if the player understands that this will mean their demise, is a strong example of this. In a way, this stage allows the player to accept they are ready to finish the main story experience. These last two stages barely need explanation, but here are a few words on each. The final boss is the climax of the gameplay experience, and in most cases will be the final sequence of interaction that the player has in the game, often a fight or culmination of gameplay mechanics previously introduced. Once the player's control over the game is removed, they no longer have agency, and therefore no longer have proper engagement with the narrative, meaning that everything after this stage comes under where the story wraps up, typically without the player's involvement. The epilogue for everything that's come before, a presentation of the final consequences to the protagonist's actions throughout the game. Sometimes this can be interactive, especially in RPGs or open world games that allow you to mess around in their playgrounds afterwards. The best example of this, in my opinion, is Red Dead Redemption, which allows you to play as the son of the protagonist to complete his father's unfinished business, including shooting the protagonist's killer if they so wish. In a lot of linear games, this might be as simple as a final cutscene preceding a long slug of credits, or a tour for the player to view the final revelations of the game, as in BioShock Infinite. So that's it. That's how we decide to dissect game stories. That's the video. But before we wrap up, I thought I'd clarify the way we score games in our videos. We do so by grading each stage of the game's plot itself on a scale from 1 to 5, and then we divide the final result by 5 to give it a score out of 12. This ranking system is arbitrary, but it's a good way to be able to easily identify more successful case studies from others. At the same time, it's important to know that this is a grading of the quality of the narrative experience rather than a score of the game as a game. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. Our next videos will be on Firewatch and Spec Ops: The Line, and we have some really exciting ideas after that, so please watch this space.